Hi, this is John Allen, the editor of Crux, an independent online Catholic news source. You can find us on the web at www.cruxnow.com. That is cruxnow.com. I am also a proud fellow at the Word on Fire Institute of Bishop Robert Barron, and you can find their terrific resources on the web at wordonfire.institute. That's .institute. Welcome to another episode of The John Allen Show. Today, we are going to be talking celibacy. More specifically, the discipline of celibacy for clergy in the Western Rite of the Catholic Church. Now, the Catholic Church has been locked in a kind of boiling debate about celibacy really for 3 years now, ever since 2017, when Pope Francis announced his intention to convene a synod of bishops on the Amazon. It was clear then that the issue of the viri probati, that is, tested married men, often older, often deacons, stable pillars of their community with families and so on, that the idea of ordaining them as priests in order to serve isolated rural communities in the Amazon, which right now might be lucky to see a priest once a year or even less regularly, that issue was going to be front and center during this synod for the Amazon. And when the curtain finally went up, as it did last October here in Rome, that prediction proved completely accurate because debate about married priests and the ability to deploy them in the Amazon to try to nurture a more complete pastoral and sacramental life for those folks, that was one of the central bones of contention, both inside the Synod, that is on the Synod floor, and certainly in the larger discussions surrounding it. So that debate has been around a while. It got turbocharged recently with the release of a blockbuster new book containing writings by Pope Emeritus Benedict XVI and also Cardinal Robert Sarra of Guinea, who is the prefect of the Vatican's Congregation for Divine Worship and the Discipline of the Sacraments, kind of its top liturgical office. In which both Pope Emeritus Benedict and Cardinal Sarra rigorously and vigorously defend the value of priestly celibacy in the Western Church. Now, there is a debate at the moment about exactly how much one can honestly say that Benedict XVI was the co-author of that book, or whether he simply contributed something he had already been working on, and the decisions about the rest of the book were sort of made by others. But honestly, that is something of a sideshow. The main event is what Pope Francis is going to do with this decision that is now on his desk. 2/3 of the bishops at the Amazon Synod voted in favor of the Pope giving permission on a limited regional basis for the ordination of married priests. Some believe we could see the Pope's conclusions as early as March. And the contributions of Pope Emeritus Benedict and Cardinal Sarra are simply one more data point, you might say, that the Pope is going to have to consider as he makes this extraordinarily vexed decision. Now, for both sides in this debate, to be honest, the question of clerical celibacy has become something of a stalking horse. That is, it is a placeholder for larger tensions in the Church. For those who are sort of urging the Pope on here, this is about Catholicism getting with the times. The late Cardinal Carlo Maria Martini of Milan, Jesuit cardinal, shortly before his death gave an interview in which he said the Catholic Church is about 200 years behind the times. So for advocates of this change, this would be one way in which Catholicism can kind of catch up. It's about forging ahead boldly on a path of reform in decentralization, experimentation, that many in this camp believe was unleashed by the Second Vatican Council, but kind of artificially frozen in place during the St. John Paul II and Benedict XVI years. On the other hand, for those opposed to this move, it's about drawing a line in the sand in defense of tradition. It's about ensuring that the Catholic Church is not simply swept away by the passing tides of a given era's fashions. And it's also about ensuring that the legacy of John Paul II and Benedict XVI isn't sort of lost or squandered. And also, to be honest, this is about Pope Francis. Those in favor of this change typically see it as part of the reforming agenda of a pope that they very much like. Those concerned about Pope Francis, and perhaps even a bit consternated about some of the directions in which he appears to be moving, they're much more likely to be opposed to this. Now, when an issue gets politicized like that, when it gets swept up into larger political, cultural, theological debates, often the facts are the first casualties. So today, we are going to try to take a look at this question as much as possible in a kind of non-political fashion. In other words, we're going to try to turn down the heat a little bit and see if we can shed some light. We will begin with a brief historical review of the discipline of priestly celibacy in the Catholic Church. Then we will provide 3 tools to think about this debate, that is, 3 important points that often get short shrift in the larger conversation. And finally, we'll talk about where this goes from here. So that's what's on the menu today. Please stick around as we unpack the often heated question of priestly celibacy in the Catholic Church.
Hey everybody, it's Jared Zimmer, the director of Bishop Robert Barron's Word on Fire Institute. I hope you're enjoying the John Allen Show, which is yet another production brought to you by the Word on Fire Institute. I wanted to take a few seconds just to invite you to become a member of the Institute, where we offer numerous different aspects that can help form you as an evangelist. Things like courses on theology and philosophy and psychology and sociology. You'll also receive a quarterly journal in the mail throughout the year. Another exclusive offer that we'll be having if you enjoy the John Allen Show is a live Q&A with John, where you can ask questions about the culture, the church, media, etc. So when you join, you also get free access to Word on Fire Digital, which houses all of Bishop Barron's feature films, topical studies, study materials, and the like. So visit wordonfire.institute and come help us proclaim Christ to the culture.
All right, let's begin with a little bit of history. Now, we know from the New Testament, we know from the early writings of the fathers of the church, that most of the original apostles, those people we would come to think of as the bishops of the church, had wives, had families, they were married. Here in Rome, for instance, if you visit the Capitoline Museum and you go in the main entryway, as you sort of look up at the spiral staircase that carries you up into the collections, you will see a life-size portrait of the wife of St. Peter. That's a figure we know about from some of those early Christian writings, and that was common practice. And so, in the next generation and those that would follow, those people we would come to think of as clerics, that is, bishops, priests, deacons. Many of them were married, had wives and families. It was considered not only acceptable, but very normal and in some ways commendable. However, very quickly also, parallel to that, arose a practice of celibacy among many of the church's clergy. Originally, it came out of the monastic tradition, hermits, desert fathers, and so on. It was highly prized. It was a sign of a man who had surrendered himself entirely to a kind of spiritual union with Christ and his church, and who was placing himself completely and unreservedly at the service of the community that he was called to lead or to serve. And that practice wasn't confined simply to the monastic tradition. Very quickly, ordinary rank and file priests, people we would come to think of as diocesan clergy, also began to adopt and imitate it, and it spread quite quickly. As early as the 4th century, there were actually regional councils or synods in Smyrna, in Carthage, that required celibacy of all of their clergy. But of course, this was an era of strong local control in Catholicism. So there were lots of other places where that was not the custom, and where clergy routinely continued to be married and have families into the early Middle Ages. Now, at that point, the debate over celibacy became intertwined with what was becoming a debate about relations between church and state or church and culture, because the early Middle Ages brought the birth of the feudal system. And what was happening is that on many feudal estates that had parishes and had priests assigned to them, the feudal lord would sometimes want to marry his children to one or more of the priest's children, in order for those children to claim some kind of right of inheritance over church property, with the idea being that that property would eventually be absorbed into the feudal estate. Now, that certainly threatened the church's financial interests. Property was the most important revenue stream in the early Middle Ages. But more than that, it threatened the church's independence. Because for the next several centuries, actually, perhaps the central defining debate about the church in medieval Europe would be the relation between throne and altar, between church and state, and ultimately whether the church would simply be subsumed into what were becoming originally feudal lordships, and then ultimately the monarchies of Europe, whether it would just become a department of the state or whether it would maintain its independence. And the practice of clerical celibacy, which maintained the independence not only of church property but also its personnel, was in a way one of the early skirmishes in that bigger fight. So, but by the peak of the Middle Ages, the era of St. Thomas Aquinas, for instance, the discipline of celibacy in the Western Church, the Latin Rite Church, had already become almost universal, very well established, and it was subsequently confirmed by a series of church councils, a series of popes, and so on. So it's a complicated history, but where we arrived in the modern period is the assumption that in the Latin Rite Church, the celibacy of clergy, bishops, priests, deacons, is the normal routine practice and an entire spirituality of the priesthood, of sexuality, and so on, has developed around explaining and defending that practice, certainly in our time. The discipline of priestly celibacy would be considered one of the cornerstone marks of Catholic identity. It's one of the things that makes Catholicism distinct from other branches of Christianity and from most of the world's other great religions. And so it is something that many priests themselves prize and that generations of Catholics have become familiar to, accustomed to, and in their own way too, I think, protective of. All right, that's the history. Now, 3 points to think about as this debate over clerical celibacy unfolds. Point 1, there already are married priests in the Catholic Church. This is not a debate over whether the Church should or should not have married priests, because it does and always has. And we don't have to reach back into the early history of the Church to find them. Today, the 23 Eastern Rite churches that are in full communion with Rome, fully Catholic, most of them have a married clergy. So the Greek Catholic Church in the Ukraine, the Coptic Catholic Church in Egypt, the Bulgarian Catholic Church, and on and on. All of these Eastern Rite churches, in general, they have the custom that their regular clergy, regular priests, are married and have families. Their bishops are called from the ranks of the monasteries where priests and monks remain celibate. And so this is a routine established practice. Even in the Western Church, by the way, there also are married clergy. In the United States, for instance, there are hundreds of former Episcopalians, Lutherans, and Methodists who were married before they came into communion with the Catholic Church, who have been allowed to remain married while being ordained as Catholic deacons, Catholic priests, and so on. So, while clerical celibacy certainly became the norm in the Western Church, it has never been 100% universal. There have always been other exceptions, which is why in the Catholic Church, priestly celibacy is thought of as a discipline, not a dogma. There is no dogma that requires clerical celibacy. However, there is a discipline that requires it in most cases, and disciplines, unlike dogmas, of course, are subject to revision and exceptions. All right, that's point 1. Point 2 is something to think about, is that Pope Francis is hardly the first modern pope to consider an exception to the discipline of clerical celibacy in the Western Church on a limited basis. In fact, Each of the last three popes have done precisely that. St. John Paul II, in 1983, approved the pastoral provision for the United States, which applied originally to members of the Episcopal Church of the United States who wished to come into communion with Rome, but who were married and who had families, who wanted to serve as priests in the Catholic Church, and on a case-by-case basis, given this authority granted by the Pope, those Episcopal ministers could be assisted in a process of discernment, and ultimately they could be ordained as Catholic priests while remaining married. Pope Benedict XVI did the same thing with the creation of a series of Anglican ordinariates, in this case allowing not simply individual ministers, but entire Anglican communities to come into full communion with Rome to preserve their liturgical and spiritual heritage, part of which was the tradition of having married priests. And so in these communities, priests who have wives, who have children, who have families, have been allowed to come into communion with the Catholic Church and continue serving while remaining married. So we don't yet know what Pope Francis is going to do on this question of allowing another limited provision for married priests in the Amazon. But what we can say for sure is that should he decide to do so, this is not, as some have described it, tantamount to overturning centuries of tradition or a radical break with his immediate predecessors, John Paul II and Benedict XVI, because in many ways he would simply be following in their footsteps. All three of these popes, John Paul II, Benedict XVI, and Pope Francis, repeatedly at various points during their pontificate had emphasized the spiritual importance, the powerful symbolism in inner significance of the practice of priestly celibacy. All have said that the practice of priestly celibacy, the discipline of celibacy as the general norm, is not open for reconsideration. And all three popes, however, looking at a specific set of pastoral circumstances, well, I should say two popes already have provided permission for married priests in such limited circumstances. One may or may not be on the brink of doing so, but it certainly would not be quite the radical departure or the upsetting of the ecclesiastical apple cart that some have described. And that brings us to point three. Because honestly, what's at issue here isn't really the specific question of whether a limited use of married priests in the Amazon would be a good idea. Honestly, if that's all this were about, I doubt there would be so much heat surrounding the debate. But I think what many people, certainly among those who are critical of this idea, what they really fear is that this may begin in the Amazon, but would hardly end there. The concern is that if the precedent is set, that you can have married priests in the Amazon, then it might well be that local churches in other parts of the world very quickly would appeal for the same kind of position or permission. And the fear is that over time this would lead to unraveling of the discipline of clerical celibacy writ large. And that may not be an entirely abstract or hypothetical concern, because it is interesting to note that in Germany at the moment, the German bishops have approved what they are calling a 2-year synodal path to kind of discern where the German church is at and what kind of pastoral strategies would serve it best going forward. The German bishops have indicated that nothing is taboo, that nothing is off the table, that people who are participating in this process can talk about anything they want. And certainly many highly vocal lay Catholic groups in Germany and theologians and so on, have all indicated that priestly celibacy and the requirement of mandatory celibacy is something that they want to talk about and that they might want to reconsider. In fact, I think one of the ironies here is that had it not been for the Amazon Synod, and in early 2020, a book comes out bearing the name of Pope Emeritus Benedict XVI, in which the former pope makes a strong argument in defense of maintaining clerical celibacy, many people right now would probably assume that that message was directed at his native Germany and at the debate that is unfolding in that country. And of course, the participants in this debate are well aware of those dynamics. So, in all honesty, we are not really right now having a debate just about the Amazon. We are having a debate about what is going on in Germany, what is going on in many other places in Western Europe and North America, and ultimately what this might portend for the global church. Now, of course, some of those same arguments came up when John Paul II approved the pastoral provision and when Benedict approved the Anglican Ordinariates. Then, too, people were saying this might lead to a broader dissolution of clerical celibacy. That, in the main, did not happen. But on the other hand, some might say we are in different circumstances and Francis is a different kind of pope. We will see. It is simply important to bear in mind that although this is being phrased as an argument about the Amazon, the buck hardly stops there. There is a much bigger context at work in this discussion. All right, finally, where do things go from here? Well, let us remember that when the Synod of Bishops on the Amazon closed at the end of October last year, bishops voted on a series of proposals, recommendations to the Pope in their final act. One of them had to do with the ordination of the viri probati, although it was confined to men who were already deacons. But the idea that these married deacons with families could, on a limited, perhaps case-by-case basis, be called into priestly service. More than 2/3 of the bishops endorsed that idea. But let us also recall that a Synod of Bishops is not the House of Representatives. This is not Parliament in the UK. It is not a decision-making body. The only power it has is to make suggestions to the Pope. Ultimately, it is up to the Pope to decide. Now, typically, the way popes have kind of put a bow on a Synod of Bishops is by issuing what's known as an apostolic exhortation, a kind of longish document reflecting on the input from a Synod of Bishops and, at least in some cases, indicating decisions about what popes heard. You will recall, for instance, that in 2016, Pope Francis issued such an apostolic exhortation called Amoris Laetitia, which drew conclusions from also contentious synods on the family that he had held in Rome in 2014 and 2015. And in that document, in one of the most famous footnotes in the history of papal verbiage, Pope Francis signaled a kind of cautious yellow light, you might call it, for the idea that divorced and civilly remarried Catholics on a limited case-by-case basis might be able to receive communion. Most expect that Pope Francis will issue a similar apostolic exhortation this time. When the Synod closed last October, the executive officers of RAPOM, which is the ecclesiastical network for the Amazon and one of the driving forces behind the Synod, they gave an interview in which they indicated that the Pope had told them that he hoped to have that apostolic exhortation ready by March. So it could come that early, it could be later. Honestly, I think it is very difficult to know at this stage how Pope Francis intends to decide this issue. When he has commented on priestly celibacy in the past, he has always begun by emphasizing how critical it is, how valuable it is, how much it is not open for reconsideration. Although, in some comments, he has also indicated that in some highly circumscribed contexts, there might be arguments for providing some flexibility. So to date, the Pope has not tipped his hand. In the wake of this book by Pope Emeritus Benedict and Cardinal Sarah, some are afraid that if the Pope were inclined to make this change, he now might be hesitant to do so because it would create or at least risk the appearance that he was contradicting Pope Benedict. Honestly, I'm not convinced by that argument. Because when the Pope made that change in Amoris Laetitia on communion for divorced and civilly remarried Catholics, there was significant, and he was well aware of it, there was significant internal opposition at that time, too. Now, admittedly, the Pope Emeritus himself, specifically, in his own voice, had not declared himself on the issue, but the Pope, Pope Francis, was clearly well aware that senior figures, including cardinals, many of whom are very close to Pope Benedict, he knew full well that they were opposed to the change that he was contemplating, and Pope Francis made it anyway. I think the history of the first 6 and some month track record of his papacy would suggest that Francis is not a man easily intimidated. That when he believes it is important to move forward, he will do so. However, he is also not someone who enjoys being painted into a corner or having his hand forced. He is also somebody who tendentially plays his cards very close to the vest. So I think the only thing, well, there's probably 2 points, honestly, that are safe to say right now. One, we do not know what Pope Francis is going to do on this issue, and anybody who is confident in predicting what the Pope is likely to do, I think the rule caveat emptor would apply. Let the buyer beware. I think the second thing we can be sure of is that no matter what Pope Francis does, it is not going to end the debate over clerical celibacy in the Catholic Church. If the Pope says no to married priests on a limited regional basis in the Amazon, many are going to wonder why not, and will continue to campaign for it. If the Pope says yes, many people will press for the same permission, the same principle to be applied in other parts of the world, while detractors of that idea, those who are convinced that it's important to maintain tradition, will probably double down on their efforts. So we will keenly await the Pope's decision, but do not be under any illusion that that is going to be the last word. This is the Catholic Church, and the last word on anything is rarely spoken. As the late Cardinal Francis George of Chicago once memorably said, in the Catholic Church, everything has happened at least once and could happen again. So the only safe strategy in this set of circumstances, ladies and gentlemen, I think would be stay tuned. We're going to continue tracking this story for you here on The John Allen Show. In the meantime, please be reading Crux at www.cruxnow.com. Also, be checking out the offerings of the Word on Fire Institute online at wordonfire.institute. Until we see one another again, have a blessed and fantastic time.